Parents gave me away to my grandparents to focus on the golden child Bcus they see my future going nowhere. But within 10 years I'm at a place where their darling daughter cannot even imagine being, so now they want me to move back and restart things. When I was younger, I made some bad choices and got caught up with the wrong crowd. I was naive, impulsive and often reckless. I fell into habits like vaping and drinking, behaviors I'm not proud of. There's no excuse for the way I acted back then. But if I'm being honest, I was just drowning in depression and anxiety. Life felt overwhelming for me, and foolishly, I believed that I could numb my pain by distracting myself. The root of that pain was losing my best friend, Jenny, when I was just 15. Jenny and I were extremely close to the point that people sometimes assumed that she was my sister. Over the years, she and I had grown up together. Hence, we were pretty much inseparable. We had made plans about everything. About going away to college together, about moving in together, about adopting a pack of dogs to raise in the perfect little house we imagined. It probably sounds childish, but those dreams were real to us. Jenny was my person. Whenever I was stressed or upset, she knew exactly how to calm me down. So, when my best friend and her parents died in a tragic accident while they were on a trip, I was devastated. Due to the nature of the accident, their bodies couldn't be recognized. As a result, their relatives had to hold a funeral without their bodies, unable to give anyone the proper closure. Losing Jenny was like losing a part of myself. Being just 15 years old, I didn't know how to keep going. The grief was overwhelming and I missed her so much that it was almost a physical ache. Sure, I had other friends, but no one came close to the bond I had with Jenny. She was irreplaceable, and that made the loneliness even harder. After her death, school became unbearable. Just walking into the building felt like a heavy weight pressing on my chest. I hated being there, hated the reminder of all the things we'd planned to do together but never would happen. I stopped caring about my classes, started falling behind on my schoolwork, and avoided people as much as I could. I didn't have the energy to talk to anyone, and honestly, I didn't want to. I became this hollow, unrecognizable version of myself, just going through the motions but not really living. That's when I turned to smoking and drinking. At first, I thought they were a solution, a way to escape the unbearable weight of my grief. When I was high or drunk, the pain of losing Jenny dulled for a little while and I could pretend I was okay. It felt like a break from constantly missing her, from the suffocating emptiness that had taken over my life. But what I didn't realize at the time was how quickly I was becoming dependent on these things. Alcohol and vaping weren't just a distraction anymore. They were becoming my coping mechanism, and I started needing them more and more to feel even slightly normal. By the time my parents realized what was happening, I was already in too deep. They tried to talk to me, to get through to me, but I wouldn't listen. I was very wrapped up in my pain and convinced myself that I didn't need anyone's help. I told myself I was fine even when I wasn't. I ignored their advice and kept sinking further into habits that were destroying me. I couldn't see it then, but I was spiraling, and I needed some serious help. The next 2 years were a blur of bad decisions and selfish behavior, and I became a complete nightmare for my family. I was out of control, staying out late into the night with no regard for their worry or the trouble I might get into. I'd take my dad's car without permission, often putting myself and others in danger by drinking and driving. Looking back, it's terrifying to think of the risks I took and how reckless I was with my life. I was so deep in my own pain and chaos that I didn't think about anyone else. I even stole money from my dad's wallet, convincing myself that he wouldn't notice or that it didn't matter even if he found out. In my mind, it was all about me, my grief, my escape, my way of numbing everything I didn't want to feel. I didn't stop to consider how my actions were tearing my family apart or how I was affecting my younger sister, Peggy. She deserved better. She deserved a role model, someone to look up to. But instead, I was selfish and absent, too consumed by my own downward spiral to see the damage I was doing. To this day, I wish I had been a better child to my parents and a better older sister to Peggy. Things finally came crashing down when one night my friends and I got caught drinking. We were all underage, so the police immediately arrested us. We had to wait in their holding cell for our parents to show up. When my parents arrived in the middle of the night, I could see the exhaustion and frustration on their faces. The car ride home was brutal. My dad was furious. He yelled at me the entire way, his voice filled with anger and hurt. My mom just kept saying how disappointed she was in me over and over again. Hearing that from her stung more than anything else. I didn't fight back or argue with them. I knew they were right. I had been acting like a complete loser and I deserved their anger. I sat there in silence, feeling the weight of their words and the reality of what I'd become. It was one of the lowest points in my life, and for the first time, I couldn't ignore how far I'd fallen. When we finally got home, my dad turned to me and announced that he just couldn't let me live in his house anymore. He didn't even try to sugarcoat it. He wanted me to get away from them before I could ruin their lives any further. My mom agreed with him and quickly backed him up by saying I was too toxic to be around and that they couldn't risk my behavior rubbing off on my little sister, Peggy. They didn't want her to turn into another version of me. Hearing those words felt like a punch to the gut. As much as I knew I'd been out of control, hearing my own parents say they didn't want me around anymore was devastating. Clearly, I had pushed them away too far and now I was facing the consequences of my actions. In the end, they decided to ship me off to live with my paternal grandparents who lived far, far away. At that time, I hadn't been close to my grandparents for years. When I was younger, I had adored them. We had such a warm and loving relationship, but as I had gotten older and fell into my downward spiral, I had lost touch with them, so I was surprised that my parents wanted me to go off and live with them. I tried to reason with my parents, but they didn't back down. My dad threatened that if I didn't want to live with my grandparents, then I could find my own accommodations because they were done looking after me. In the end, I had no choice but to go and live with my grandparents. Part of me wondered why they even agreed to take me in, considering the mess I'd become, but I was also grateful that they were giving me a place to live when my own parents didn't want me under their roof anymore. I knew this would be my last chance to turn things around. At least now I had somewhere to go and maybe, just maybe, I could figure out how to rebuild my life. From the moment I arrived, my paternal grandparents warmly welcomed me into their homes and lives. My granny was especially kind and understanding. She told me that she and Grandpa knew I'd been going through a hard time and assured me they were there to help me heal and get back on track. She even told me not to hold any resentment towards my parents for kicking me out, explaining that they were struggling too and probably didn't know how else to handle the situation. Granny's words stuck with me. She was the first person besides Jenny who actually sat down with me, listened to what I had to say, and made me feel like I mattered as a person, not just a problem to be fixed. At first I did feel awkward living with my grandparents. I wasn't used to the quiet life they led or the way they seemed to genuinely care about me without any conditions or judgment. But as the weeks turned into months, I began to settle in. I started to see their home as a safe space and that awkwardness I felt eventually faded. Over time, I began attending a local college during the day and in the afternoon, I helped my grandpa on his farm. Anyone who has done farm work knows that it isn't easy work. There were long hours of physical labor and I'd often come back to the house at the end of the day completely exhausted. I will say that this exhaustion became a blessing in disguise for me. I was so tired at the end of each day that I didn't have the energy or even the desire to turn to alcohol or vaping anymore. Slowly but surely my mind began to clear and I started to feel like a better version of myself. I even started going for therapy to address the deeper issues I had been avoiding for so long. Talking to a therapist was eye-opening. It helped me confront the grief I had buried after losing Jenny and face the unhealthy ways I had tried to cope like alcohol and vaping. During this time, my parents had completely cut off all contact, saying they needed space from me and had just left me on my own with my grandparents to figure my life out. As much as it hurt, I tried to respect their wishes. And this is when my therapist suggested I could perhaps use writing as a way to communicate with them, specifically writing letters. The idea was to express what I was feeling, what I was working on, and how I was trying to become a better person. It was a way to bridge the gap even if they weren't ready to talk to me directly. So that's what I did. Every week without fail I wrote a letter to my parents. I poured my heart into those letters, sharing my thoughts, progress, and reflections. I told them about the therapy sessions, about the farm work with Grandpa, about college and how much I regretted the pain I had caused them. It gave me hope that one day they might pick up the phone, call my grandparents or even write back to me, but they never did. For nearly 4 years, I sent those letters faithfully, hoping each time that this one might be the one to make a difference. Still, there was no response, just silence. Occasionally, I'd hear updates about my family through my cousins. They'd tell me how my parents were doing fine, how Peggy was excelling at school and making them proud. I couldn't help but feel a pang of jealousy when I heard those things. I wanted to be part of that life again, to feel like I belonged in my own family, but clearly they didn't want me anymore. So slowly, I learned to let them go and stop sending them any letters after that. Over the years, I carried forward living my life by working on myself. After graduating from college, I landed a job as a telemarketer, a role that surprisingly turned out to be a perfect fit for me. I've always been very social and I discovered that I have a natural talent for persuasion. Over the years, my knack for engaging with people and my persistence paid off. I have steadily climbed the ranks in the company, first getting promoted to a team leader and eventually to my current position as a sales manager. One of the perks of my job is its flexibility. Since most of my responsibilities can be handled with just a laptop, Wi-Fi, and a webcam, I have been able to stay with my grandparents. This arrangement has allowed me to save a significant portion of my income while also being there for my grandparents. They took care of me for years when I needed it most, and now I try to return the favor in any way I can. I buy groceries for them, pay their utility bills and help Grandpa with the farm animals whenever I'm not working. 2 months ago, something amazing happened. Grandpa helped me secure a small piece of land that was being auctioned off at a very low price. I poured my entire life savings into buying it, and I can honestly say it's the best decision I've ever made. I chose to invest in this land because I didn't want to move away from my grandparents or this community. This place has become my sanctuary. It's where I found a sense of belonging, where I've finally made friends I enjoy spending time with, and where I've built meaningful connections with neighbors who treat me like family. Most importantly, this place doesn't remind me of my dark alcoholic past. Over the past few weeks, I've been slowly working on building a house on my land while also working full-time. And to be honest, it's been both hectic and stressful. Yesterday, out of nowhere, I was informed that my parents had finally reached out to my grandparents wanting to talk to me after almost a decade of silence. At the time of their call, I had been out grocery shopping. Later, when I came back home, my grandma sat me down gently and told me that my parents had called. It was the last thing I expected to hear. Apparently, my parents had told my grandparents they missed me after all these years and wanted me to call them back as soon as possible. My first reaction was pure confusion. After nearly 10 years of hearing nothing, no replies to my letters, no acknowledgement of my efforts, no attempt to mend things, now all of a sudden they wanted to talk? It didn't make sense. I could see the same surprise mirrored in my grandparents' expressions. They were just as shocked as I was. So grandfather, never one to mince words, told me that if I wanted, I could just ignore them the way they had ignored me all these years. He had seen how hard I had worked to rebuild my life. He didn't want me to get hurt again. My grandma assured me that the decision was entirely mine to make. She said that whether I chose to reach out to them or not, she and Grandpa would support me and stand by my side. Right now, I'm overwhelmed with a mix of emotions. I can't tell if I should be happy or anxious. I'm unsure of what steps to take next. Ida, if I do decide to not respond back to them since they pretty much forgot about me all these years. Update 1. First of all, thank you to everyone for being so understanding and kind about my past issues. I now realize that my parents should have taken me to a grief counselor after I lost my best friend instead of just ignoring my problems. Maybe if they had, I wouldn't have turned to alcohol and vaping. However, I can't completely blame them either. I did disappoint them a lot. Still, I wish they could have forgiven me, especially since I was just a child at the time. To clarify a few other points that keep coming up, I have changed my number over the years, which is why my parents couldn't reach me directly and had to talk to my grandparents about it. I think this was a good thing since I don't know how I would have reacted had they called me directly. After writing to my parents for a few years, I stopped sending them any more letters since they never replied back to me. I don't know if they ever read my letters or just threw them away. No, my parents never sent any money to my grandparents throughout all the years I lived with them. They just didn't care about my existence once I was gone from their home. Luckily, my grandparents took care of me, and this is why I owe my life to them. Peggy and I have absolutely no relationship anymore. After I moved away, I was busy changing myself for the better, and my parents kept Peggy as far away from me as possible. As some of you pointed out in the comments, I do owe it to my parents to at least hear them out before I just ignore them, so that's what I'm going to do. Update 2. It's been a month since my last update. The reason I couldn't update earlier is because I had a lot of things going on. Turns out my parents actually had an ulterior motive to reach out to me. We sat down for a video call, which initially started off on a positive note. My parents told me just how glad they were of the progress I had made over the years and how happy they were to hear from my relatives and grandparents that I had completely turned my life around. It felt good to hear those words from them after so many years of silence and rejection. For a brief moment, it felt like I was finally being seen for the person I had become. Next, they spent 20 minutes bragging about my sister on all the things she had accomplished. They went on and on telling me how proud they were of her, how she was doing so well in life, how she was excelling in every aspect of her life. Of course, I was happy for Peggy. She deserved all the praise and I never wanted to take anything away from her. But in that moment, it felt like they were rubbing it in. I mean, this was our first conversation even after so long. Anyway, after that, my dad finally admitted that there was a reason they had reached out to me after all these years. This is when my dad explained that they had heard through our relatives that I had bought myself a piece of land and had made significant financial progress which they had never expected. He joked how he had always thought Peggy would be the successful one. But turns out I was the one who had surpassed all his expectations. I was caught off guard by his backhanded compliment, but I just laughed awkwardly to ease the tension as I didn't know where he was going with this. He then went on to say how he and Mom had a favor to ask me. When I asked what they meant, my dad hesitated for a moment before revealing that my mom had been diagnosed with breast cancer recently. I was stunned to hear this as he continued to explain how they hadn't told anyone about it yet as it had just been a month. My mom had started chemotherapy, but she also needed surgery and apparently the costs were piling up. My dad told me how over the years he had used up most of his money to help Peggy through college and even bought my younger sister an apartment for herself, which is why now with Mom's unexpected medical emergency, they just didn't have enough money left to cover her treatment. This is why when they found out about my land purchase from our relatives, they finally reached out to me hoping I could help. My mom told me she understood how this might sound to me, how it might feel strange or uncomfortable to help them out financially, given everything that had happened between us. She acknowledged the years of silence, but she said they were desperate now. The bills were rising and they just didn't have the resources to cover them. They had nowhere else to turn but me. She suggested that I could perhaps move back home to live with them and this way we could finally start to restart our relationship and make things right. At that moment, I felt a rush of conflicting emotions. On one hand, hearing that my mom was battling cancer was devastating. Of course, I wanted to help her, she was my mother. But on the other hand, I couldn't just go back home to them. My whole life was here now. I also couldn't ignore the frustration and bitterness I still felt from the years they had cut me off. I couldn't help but wonder why they were asking me for help in the first place when they had their beloved daughter to turn to instead. So I asked them if Peggy knew about my mom's cancer and they confirmed that she did but that they felt Peggy was too young to help them and that she shouldn't be burdened with their medical bills. Apparently, my sister also didn't have a good enough job like mine. So according to them, I was the only one who could really assist them in their time of need. I told them quite honestly that if they had reached out to me before I bought my land, I would have had the financial means to help them readily. But after this purchase, I had no life savings left. I had invested everything into my future and was working hard to refill my bank account while also building myself a house. I had no money left to send them for their needs. My dad then interrupted me, telling me that I could start by at least sending them a few $100 from my salary every month. As for the rest of the money, he urged me to talk to my grandparents and see if they could pitch in. If it was still not enough, then he suggested that I could also arrange a fundraiser, perhaps online, to raise money for Mom's treatment and help them out in any way that I can. I was surprised at how casually they seemed to expect me to just jump into the role of their financial savior after all this time. I mean, this was our first conversation in almost a decade, and they were already asking me for money, asking me to fix their financial problems without so much as acknowledging the emotional weight of everything that had happened between us. I told them that if they really needed a few $100, maybe I could send them something. But there was no guarantee. I had my own financial struggles to deal with and I couldn't stretch myself any thinner. I also made it clear that I would never ask my grandparents to loan my parents any money. They had already done so much for me over the years, and they already had enough on their plate. My grandparents didn't deserve to be dragged into this situation again. When I said that, I could see my parents' reactions shift instantly. They were not happy. My mom's face tightened and she immediately started to accuse me of being inconsiderate. She said they would have never reached out to me if they hadn't been desperate. But now she was disappointed that I was still the same selfish, immature child who only thought of myself. She reminded me how I had almost ruined their lives with my bad choices all those years ago. I argued with my mom that although I acknowledged my wrongdoing, it's not like they didn't punish me for it. I mean, they had literally shipped me off to my grandparents and had cut off contact with me. Not once had they reached out to ask how I was doing or even acknowledged what I had been through. And now when they finally did contact me, it was all about what they needed from me. How could they have the nerve to call me selfish when they had never once considered my feelings or struggles? My dad exasperatedly said that they couldn't go back and change things, but now they knew I was doing well in life and that's exactly why they were reaching out. He mentioned the sacrifices him and Mom had made raising me and how, after everything they had done for me, he felt it was the least I could do to send money for my mom's treatment. He even had the nerve to suggest that I could properly look into selling off my land, the land I had worked so hard to purchase, and give them the entire amount. He assured me that if I did that, they would never ask me for any money again in the future. At that moment, all I saw was red. I felt my chest tighten with anger, and I told them flat out that I owed them nothing. I had already apologized over and over again in all the letters I had written to them over the years, but it was clear they had never even bothered to read them. I made it clear that whatever I had become, whatever progress I had made was because of my own hard work and the support of my grandparents who never abandoned me no matter how awful I had been. I told my parents that if there was anyone I would be willing to sacrifice for, it would be them, my grandparents, who had helped me become a better person and who had been there for me when my own parents had walked away. They were the ones who gave me a second chance at life, not my parents. My mom tried to argue back, but I told her I didn't care what she and Dad thought of me anymore. I was done with this conversation, done with trying to make them understand. I had spent enough time and energy trying to win their approval, and it had only ever led to more disappointment and hurt. They had made their choices over the years, and now I was making mine. I was finished. They needed to find a way to help themselves or ask their youngest daughter to pitch in because I wouldn't be doing anything for them. Since that heated conversation, my dad has been sending me a constant stream of messages trying to guilt-trip me into feeling responsible. He's told me how my mom has been crying for days over what I said and how hurt she is by my words. He says that if anything happens to her, it will all be on me. Part of me feels guilt. After all, it's my mom and no one wants to hear their mom is sick, no matter how complicated their relationship is. But at the same time, I can't let them manipulate me into giving them money when I really don't have any. I'm just so exhausted by this. Update 3. It's been 4 months since my last update. I just wanted to let you all know that I still haven't helped my parents and neither have my grandparents. First of all, my parents eventually did tell my grandparents about my mom's cancer and asked them for money. Luckily, my grandfather immediately turned them down and refused to send them any money. Without hesitation, my grandfather told my dad that he needed to step up and take care of mom as it wasn't our responsibility to do so. The only thing my grandma offered was to fly down there herself to take care of my mom if she ever needed it. But beyond that, they were not able to offer anything else. When my parents heard this, they were furious, but honestly, there wasn't much they could do about it. After all, my grandparents aren't obligated to help them, especially after everything that has happened between us all. I guess my parents are finally reaping the consequences of their own actions.